Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join today's session, IP Fundamentals. I am Claudia Kriviak, CEO at the Ontario Centre of Innovation. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which we gather. OCI's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories. First, for some housekeeping items. Please use the Q&A box for any questions you may have during the presentation, and I will try my best to ask them to the presenters. If I miss any questions, we will follow up with you separately. As many of you know, OCI builds capacity in emerging and advanced technologies. We strengthen and leverage Ontario's tech sector. And most importantly, and the reason why we are here today, we accelerate the commercialization of Made in Ontario IP. And it is for that reason that OCI and the Innovation Asset Collective, or IAC, are very pleased to have you join this virtual education session on IP fundamentals. With the accelerating pace of economic activity derived from intangible products and services related to the tech sector, Ontario's global competitive advantage is increasingly linked with our ability to foster, commercialize, and protect Made in Ontario IP. We know IP can dramatically alter the growth trajectory of a company. Those companies that include an IP strategy as a part of their business plan are better positioned to capture the associated growth benefits. We also know, like you, that SMEs are the key drivers of IP-related prosperity outcomes. So I hope you find value in today's session, and I encourage you to take advantage of the expertise brought to us today by IAC's VP, IP Innovation Strategy, Erin Pisko, and VP of Partnerships and Member Engagement, Lori DeGraw. Thank you, and I'll now turn the session over to Erin and Lori, and we'll have a Q&A following their presentation.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Very excited to be here today and speaking to all of you. As Claudia mentioned, we're going to use the Q&A function, and Lori and I will do our best to get to all the questions. And with that, next slide, please. So Claudia really set the stage for why IP matters, but I just want to touch on a few additional points. And really, this graphic really showcases the value of it. Some of you may have seen it before. It's pretty popular when we're talking about why IP matters in the space today, but it really shows the dramatic shift from a tangible to an intangible economy over the past 30 years. And while this graphic ends at 2019, we're continuing to see this trend grow, as is really evident in the Global Innovation Index report that was issued by WIPO late last year. And what this really shows is the monumental shift from in this 1975, where really only 17% of the economy was in the intangible space, versus 2019, we're at 91% and growing. Because global innovation trends really owe to the digital transformation of society today, and we've really created this new intangible economy. And central to that is intellectual property. So it's really important to understand how intellectual property factors into your business. And one question we get all the time is, well, I'm a service company, I'm a SaaS company, is IP really important? IP is important for everybody. It just depends on the type of IP that will be relevant for your business. Next. So focusing on that, as I mentioned, the Global Innovation Report really provided some interesting statistics. And on the world stage, Canadian innovation ownership really is limited to about 1% of the key players. And further to that, of that 1%, over 50% is actually foreign owned. And what I mean by that is Canadian invented, when you look at geocoded data for Canadian inventorship, and those assets then become transferred to have foreign ownership. So of our small percentage we're starting with, even less of it becomes a factor on the world stage. And the graphic is something we pulled recently that shows sort of the top 5 and then Canada and how they stack up against those sort of top 5. And you can see when you look at PCT filings as a leading indicator, and a similar trend can be showcased regardless of what data set you're looking at. Really, Canada is substantially lagging when it comes to leveraging their intellectual property. We're good at the input side, we're good at innovation and funding innovation, looking at R&D, institutional support, but when it comes to translating those inputs into outputs, those intangibles, those assets that can really drive revenue and create value for your company, Canada is really lagging these other economies. So how do we fix that? Next. So in my mind, IP strategy is what really drives the ability for Canadian companies to be able to compete on this global stage. And at IAC, when we think about intellectual property strategy, we're really talking about how a company generates assets that really enables their ability to grow and scale their company. And those rights are really derived from IP that you either own or have access to, because you can't leverage what you don't own. And that really becomes increasingly important when you look at how Canada stacks up on a global stage, because we really need to protect this core value at the central point of all our companies. And once it's built, once you have put in place a strategy that can help you identify and capture assets that can drive value for your business to really set you apart from the other players in the marketplace, your business can grow and scale. So there's a few key things I like to say that businesses should keep in mind. And the first is what I mentioned already. You can only leverage what you own or have access to. And you can only own those assets that you've actually identified that have value to your business. And in order to understand your value proposition, you have to know where to even start looking in your business for those IP assets. And when you think about your value proposition, it's really about how you plan to address that market need. If you think back, depending on how long your company's been around, that aha moment, why did you start your business? Everybody starts their business because you have an angle, you have something you're looking to fill within the market, a need that isn't met. Maybe you're cheaper, maybe you're more efficient, maybe you're plug and play in a system that's unusually complex. But there's always a moment. And if you really go back to that value proposition and start thinking about how your IP assets can be built to support those moments and your ability to grow and scale, you're going to set your business up for success. Companies like Aon and the leaders who lead those groups like Lewis Lee, really one of the famous quotes I like that he said is, you really should start planning your IP strategy from day one, and it needs to be interwoven with your business strategy. And that's what we look to talk to our member companies about when we're working with them at IAC. Next. So I'm not going to go into detail on this slide. It simply highlights the specific types of IP rights that can come into play when you're looking at an IP strategy. And their patents and trademarks are the most common. People have heard of them: confidential information and trade secrets, copyright, and industrial design. So those are the things you want to have in the back of your mind and the types of assets that you can create. But your IP strategy touches on so much more than just your IP assets. Next. So when you think about intellectual property in your organization, it's really everywhere. While people typically associate innovation and intellectual property rights often with R&D groups, it's simply not the case, because it can really come into play anywhere. And it's so much more than just a legal deliverable, irrespective of the fact that IP rights themselves might be legally obtained, that it's a leadership deliverable. It's a deliverable that everybody in an organization can contribute to, because everybody has a role to play. And misconceptions and lack of understanding in this space can be really common. And there's a few stories that I'd like to share just sort of around downfalls. And one of those is about identifying who's going to be contributing to IP in your organization. There's a famous case. I'm located in Calgary, Alberta, and in Calgary back in the late 90s. If anyone who's been here and tries to park in downtown Calgary, you're going to encounter the Park Plus parking meters. Those were actually can be drawn back to a couple engineers who were working at the city of Calgary back in the late, I guess the late 80s. They came up with this concept of, wouldn't it be great if there was like a way to easily access parking across the city. Could we use this as a tool? And they came up with these great parking meters, but they weren't hired. They didn't work for the city in an invention capacity. That wasn't part of their job. They were traffic engineers. They controlled the lights and the infrastructure. And so their employment agreements were silent on any type of IP. So these folks were able to develop and file patent applications that they owned. And there was a big dispute with the city about the ownership of the IP. And the failure of the employment agreement to properly call out the ownership really became a downfall in the city of Calgary ended up having to pay a heavy toll to get access to those parking meters and that technology. And things like that happen all the time. So when you're crafting employment agreements, it's really important to consider that intellectual property relates to more than just your R&D staff. Another common misconception that comes into play periodically is that once you filed your first patent application, you're fully protected. We hear companies say all the time, I've got a provisional, I'm all good. Intellectual property doesn't have a start and a stop date. Once you filed one application, you haven't ticked the box and you don't need to revisit it. It's really important when you're thinking about strategy that it continues to grow with your business and scale with your business, and you continue to seek out opportunity. And further to that, it's more than just about patents. It's your brand. How are people recognize how you show up in the business? How are they going to know who to look to for particular products? How do you differentiate yourself in that competitor space? Because your end users, if you're looking at a consumer, they're not necessarily going to know all the details and the technical sophistication that sets you apart. So how are you going to draw them in? And so making sure you have protected your brand and you've thought about that in the early days can be important. So Jim Balsillie is the board chair of IAC. I'm sure many people have heard of him more as the CEO of RIM, or Research in Motion, one of the big Canadian success stories. And Jim loves to say that if you don't have a strategy for protecting and owning your intellectual property, it doesn't matter how much money you're going to sink into it, it's always going to leak out. Next. So I have lots of experience in intellectual property, but I like to think about IP is a teachable skill. And when teaching SMEs like yourselves how to visualize IP strategy, I like to break it down into these three basic building blocks that I think resonate with everybody. The first being, what's your edge? What is your product or service differentiation in the marketplace? And this can really go back to that aha moment that you're thinking about. Why did you start your business? What gap do you fill? Where's the market failing now? Where's that commercial need? What's your customer pain point? How does your solution address that? And what's available to you? Where is the white space? So many times there's lots of players in the market, and it can be critically important to understand how you fit into that space and what's available to you in terms of from a rights perspective. Is your technology best protected using a patent application? It doesn't have to be readily disclosed. Should you be seeking protection for your brand? What does that look like? How does that all fit in? You know, is your technology something that's going to be really difficult for people to actually come up with, and it's better suited to a trade secret? So understanding these three things together can really help you identify where the sweet spot of your opportunity is. And we like to bring them all together. And when you're starting out, you really want to try to look at that central point when you think about these three things. That intersection point is really where the development of your IP strategy wants to start, where you are addressing the market need, you're protecting what sets your company apart, and you're owning the available space that can really help your company. And over time, if you only articulate your strategy in one of these directions, you can really fail to protect real market opportunities that are available for you. And once your IP strategy is up and running and you've started putting these principles into place, because it's never too early to get started, you can really end up having a strategy that allows you to drive revenue and growth through the ability to exclude others through your assets, potentially license opportunities, and really get your slice of the market share, possibly through third-party sales or recognition of a market sector that you're not serving. The ability to increase your profitability through these rights, through the ability to exclude others, and to help you mitigate risk if you have someone show up on your doorstep and start asking for a piece of the pie through their own IP rights. If you've developed your own portfolio, you can really help mitigate what that risk looks like. Next slide. So that was a lot of information. This is just sort of a quick overview that tries to highlight where we like to think about where you are without a strategy, and where often that means you're reactive. You're reacting to something, that an event that's happened, something that someone's thrown at you, a curveball. But with an IP strategy, you can be forward looking and look to identify opportunities, roadblocks, and build out a portfolio that supports your business. Because IP assets that don't support your business really have no value. It can end up being something that you spend a lot of money on that essentially sits on a shelf. Whereas assets that are really protecting that core value proposition of your business, that thing that sets you apart, can be a mechanism for revenue generation. You don't end up in a situation where you are hindered with your ability to grow and scale because there's something happening within the marketplace that you weren't aware of. The strategy can help open new market opportunities for you, potentially present opportunities that you weren't previously available to. And overall, I believe strategy really enables better decision making. But strategies aren't built in isolation. This isn't a one-person exercise or something that's one and done, in the sense that you've built it, it's good, again, you've ticked a box. An IP strategy is a living, breathing exercise, and it needs to continue to be revisited and needs to grow with your business as you move forward. Next slide. So we can't talk about strategy without talking about cost, because I feel like that's potentially the first question people ask me, like, I can't afford to have an IP strategy, IP is too expensive. And I counter, nobody is too small, and IP strategy doesn't have to be expensive. It's important to understand your budget and your scope that's available and prioritize your spend. If you take the time to do the forward thinking when you get started, as opposed to just immediately going from, some really interesting innovation that you think is exciting to immediately moving to an IP right to protect it without doing that thinking of understanding how it's going to support your business value, you can spend money that you don't have. And so really prioritizing protection of those key assets can be critically important. And the last point is, again, IP isn't something you just file and you're done. It needs to continue to be supported as it grows, just like a plant. You have to water it. Unfortunately, all types of IP rights, they all have ongoing costs. And so it's not enough to just plan your budget for today or tomorrow, but you need to plan down the road for that 2, 5, 10-year plan and understand what that looks like. And with that quick speed through IP strategy, I'm going to turn it over to Lori to talk about IAC and a little bit of how we work with our companies on being able to tackle this concept.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you so much to everyone for joining today, and especially a huge thanks to Claudia and the entire OCI team for your excellent partnership in supporting Ontario's SMEs. It's been great to work with you over the years. So IAC's program has been developed as a way to address the needs that Erin just identified and to help companies map out that plan around IP strategy and to determine what their next steps should be and the way to think and talk about IP. I can say that IAC was founded out of an initiative from the federal government. The founders of the organization, as well as Jim Balsillie, had been speaking with federal leaders for many, many years to describe the fact that data, IP were areas that Canada really needed to invest in a much more significant way. There needed to be more awareness, and there certainly needed to be more programs to support Canadian companies as they look for ways to expand. We know Canadians are incredibly inventive, innovative entrepreneurs, so it's about protecting those interests as they scale globally. This program was developed as part of the federal government's intellectual property strategy, which was developed in 2018. And the program was a successful receipt of the grant program, which was $30 million and came into being in 2020 was the official launch of IAC. Next slide, please. So the whole mandate and our purpose in the organization is to really underline some of the areas of importance that Erin just identified, to make sure that Canadian business leaders are thinking about IP and understand the value it brings into their business, to help them take that time and take those steps, make the investments in order to build their own position around IP. And then we have some tools to help them in the interim, which I'll get into very shortly. We want to ensure that Canadian companies have as much control over what they're inventing and their innovations and their novel processes as they possibly can. We know that, as Erin said, the resources are not unlimited. So we want to make sure that Canadian leaders understand and have the information that they need in order to make really great decisions around where they're investing their resources and the kinds of decisions they're putting into their strategy overall. And the interesting thing about IAC, and there's one particular pillar of our program, although all of it is looking at the collective opportunity, there's certainly one area that has a very unique approach to that in our program. So I'll get into those details in the next slide. So we developed the program around these 4 pillars. As companies come on board as members, they're able to engage with any or all of them, depending on what their needs are, depending on sometimes their maturity or their level of sophistication around IP. But really, this is intended to be something that companies can dive into as much as they're able to, and that will support them at different phases of their development. So I'll get into each of these specifically, but just as an overall of the 4 pillars, the first is IP education and strategy. This underpins every single thing that we do at IAC, because without that focus on the language, on the way to think about IP, the strategy behind it, how it dovetails with business strategy, all of the other pieces of this program are much more difficult to make any progress on. So we really understand that that's the foundational piece. IP funding is some grant programs to help support IP. The IAC IP portfolio, which is the collective piece of this, I'll describe shortly. And then, of course, the market intelligence to help make really good decisions within the sector that we work in. Next slide, please. So the IP education and strategy is really about developing that foundational knowledge base and hopefully integrating a culture of IP at the organization. When we had our first anniversary event a little while ago, which we're about 1.5 years into operations, as I say, a little bit more than that, we had member companies come on board and explain some of the benefits they were receiving from the program. And I recall one company from the Maritime said that incorporating an IP culture into their organization had changed everything about what they did, because it took it out of, as Erin said, out of the legal department's domain, and really it integrated into the leadership's decision-making around strategy. It integrated into the product development teams, and really was a comprehensive foundation to everything they did. And they're already seeing the results of that 1 year into membership at IAC. So that foundation becomes something that helps map out the future. The benefit, I would say, from IAC's education offering is that we really do this in a way that's intended to be accessible for business leaders. So we're not looking at, trying to train up new patent lawyers. Our thought process is more around, what do business leaders need to know? How do they need to speak? And how can they implement and execute on their IP strategy in a significant way? Next slide, please. The IP funding comes in kind of 2 prongs, and I'll explain the credit piece secondarily. So in terms of IP grants, we do have a few different tiers of membership, but our full members receive quarterly grants that they can apply for. These are merit-based grants, and they're intended to reward the very best ideas that our member companies come up with to move the needle around IP development. So these are not technical assessments around our grant program. It really is thinking about that strategy piece. What do you need to evolve in your business, and what kind of IP could you develop or file or even start to think about in terms of perhaps engaging a consultant. So we're looking for, what are you thinking about that could move you to the next level around IP? And we're rewarding those best ideas. We have over $100,000 per quarter available. Our average grant is around $15,000 to $20,000, depending on what the requirements are for the IP idea to be moved forward. We also have some grant rounds for associate members, which is for early stage companies. There's some specific criteria around who qualifies for that. It's less funding and less frequently. It's 2 a year rather than quarterly. And we also have a program that supports women and female owned and founded companies with specific funding that's twice a year as well. The IP credit is relevant only to the full membership. The way we've developed this too is really to incentivize member companies to invest in their IP. So full membership in IAC for a year is $15,000. That's 1.5, since I've been misheard on that front before. And that $15,000 isn't something that is necessarily a revenue stream for us, but instead we take that funding, we hold it in a credit bank on behalf of that member company. And as they spend on IP over the course of the year that they're an IAC member, they can submit their paid invoices to us and will be reimbursed right up to the maximum of $15,000. So we're not interested in having companies join and just become members and not really engage in the subject matter. We really encourage our members to use their new knowledge and use that skill set by continuing to invest. And this can cover all kinds of territories around IP expenditures from existing IP. It's international, it's with any service provider. We're not prescriptive. We just want to know there's activity in that space within the business. Next slide, please. The IP portfolio, as I mentioned, is the piece that is really collective in nature. It's also very novel in Canada, although not so globally. This is a tried and true method in a number of jurisdictions internationally. And the whole thought process behind this is to, again, protect the position of our member companies as they're growing out their own IP portfolios, as they're strategically thinking about their competitors and making sure that they're mapping out the course for their business. In the interim, though, what IAC is doing is looking at the marketplace for available IP, and we are acquiring it and holding it on behalf of our membership. We have a dedicated team of experts who are evaluating what would be meaningful IP to hold on behalf of our membership. And really what this is meant to do is to deter anyone who might be asserting globally. So the way that for whom this idea might be kind of new, a lot of times the way to push back a new entrant into a certain market is to assert against them with IP, to say, you're infringing in our space and we're going to push you back. So little Canadian company, we are going to try and find ways to limit your growth. With the defensive shield that IAC is developing, it's a way to have resources available, a stockpile, so to speak, of IP that this company can use to protect its interests, defend its position, and wait until they have the portfolio of their own to do that kind of effort. So it's a novel idea, but as I say, it's one that is used extremely effectively in other parts of the country or in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. Finally, we offer quarterly market intelligence. This is to all of our tiers of members, and this is a very deep dive into different areas within the clean tech sector. We are mandated to focus only on data-driven clean tech companies at this stage, SMEs. So we look into certain sectors within that space, and we'll do extremely deep dives into what's been going on within that space, where there's been certain activity, providing the best, most up-to-date information for business leaders to use and to parlay into their business strategy. And they're thinking about where there's opportunities, perhaps where there's areas of risk, and again, using their resources in the best way they possibly can. Of course, we're in a pilot project where we're continuing to refine the program depending on feedback we get from members, and that's what we really aim to do. We want to support member companies in the best way that we can So when we released these initial reports, some of our member companies said, this is fantastic. I've never seen such a deep level of conversation. I just don't quite know what to do with it. So we're also developing tutorials and supportive tools to help companies understand how to use the information that's provided in these deep dives into market intelligence. We produced 3 reports to date and have a very deep pipeline of new reports that will be available shortly. Next slide, please. So here's the summary of what I've discussed with you today, which is the educational piece. But one part that I didn't mention here, so it's good it's in my summary slide, is that we also, based on feedback from our members, developed some members networking events so that there was a place where people could just do some information sharing about some of their experiences within IP, some of their processes, what are their approaches. We found that through this feedback that there weren't always great places to just get together and casually and formally discuss things with some colleagues. So we have these member-only events. We have obviously the IP grant program, the market intelligence reports, and that defensive shield through the IAC patent portfolio. Next slide, please. Finally, obviously, we work with some great partners across the country. Lali at the BDC is a very strong partner of IAC, and she has a great quote here. I believe this also came from our first anniversary event. But I would also say that in speaking with Lali, one of the things she has described around member companies at IAC is she sees that they really that IAC is really making these companies investment ready. I think that's a huge statement around understanding that for investors, having a very solid IP strategy and being able to articulate that is a critical component of being investment ready and successful in various investment rounds. So we appreciate that partnership with the BDC. Next slide. Also working with the Council of Canadian Innovators. This is a long quote here that I won't read and won't expect you to get through, but really it's, again, having that aligned goal around making sure that companies are ready to participate fully in the new global economy and strengthening our position moving forward into the 21st century knowledge economy. Next slide, please. And of course, we work with partners across the system, including all of the superclusters. And we definitely appreciate being able to align our efforts to their work in this space as well. And I think that takes us to the end here. Last slide. From our board chair. And of course, yes, that's part of the issue is coming at this in a way that is practical, efficient, and really does help business leaders achieve the goals that they've set for themselves, and making sure that there's a clear path to protecting your interests. And next slide, please. For anyone who's interested in learning more about membership, I've certainly encourage you to reach out to Russia, who is can answer any of the specific questions that you may have. I know that in some cases there's a bit of nuance in terms of how our program can support business leaders. So Russia can speak through that with you. You can also go to our website to get more information, and we encourage you to do so. Final slide here. That brings us to the end, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
I think you're on mute, Claudia. Oh.
The host has muted me and now is asking me to unmute. Can you hear me now? Awesome. That was great, Lori and Erin. That was fantastic and very, very informative. We have a few questions that have come in through the Q&A, and I'm just going to go through some of them. So we have a few questions related to the different membership tiers, and if you could perhaps talk about the difference between the two tiers, and also who is membership open to? Is it just open to SMEs, or for example, would it be open to a university or a tech transfer office?
Thank you for that, Claudia. So we have a clear mandate through our contribution agreement for funding from the federal government. And we first are required to work in terms of membership, specifically with data-driven clean tech SMEs. So we certainly have great partnerships like we do with OCI, and we have some other formal partnerships with organizations across the country. We also have a lot of friends in the ecosystem across the country that we work with and have very aligned goals. But in terms of actual membership, it is limited to data-driven clean tech SMEs. The two tiers that I mentioned, I would say that our core mandate really is to support scaling businesses. That's the full membership tier I mentioned, the paying membership that gets access to the full range of the 4 pillars that IAC has developed. And that requires a company that's probably already proven and understands its value proposition. It's a company that's probably already global or will soon be. It's a company that's probably already involved in IP in some way. And we do have some criteria set out in our membership agreement about just the size of that company as well, so some of the restrictions around that. When we were developing and launching the program for what we call the scaling businesses, we recognized based on some early stage companies reaching out to us that there was certainly a need to plant the seed. And like Erin said, it's really critical to think about IP from day one, even if it's not something you're necessarily actioning immediately. So we wanted to find some way to support those businesses as well. So we launched the associate member tier, which is a freemium version. There's no cost to join. However, there's a more limited access to the education and strategy sessions, a more scaled back funding program, and the full market intelligence is provided to that tier, but not access to the IAC portfolio yet, because they're probably not at the stage where they're also encountering that kind of risk globally yet. So they grow into that role. That is for a company that has also some criteria associated with it, but it really is intended for early stage. So we're not looking for more mature, sophisticated companies in that tier.
Great, thank you, Lori. Another question that has come up a couple of times is, what's the first step? So let's say you are a startup company, you have some great technology. What is one of the first things you should do in terms of starting down the path of protecting your IP?
Claudia, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. And I would suggest that instead of going directly to starting to think about what rights best protect my business or my opportunity, I would suggest instead the best place to start is pulling together some people from your business, different sectors. Maybe you've got some BD, some research guys, maybe some people down in marketing, really cover the different aspects of your business and start with a brainstorming session. When you start looking at that, maybe you have a lead product or a software or algorithm, and start thinking about that. And what are the elements related to that product that sets you apart? What really enables that product to make a difference in the market? And start there and thinking about what those enabling pieces are, because in the end, those are the most important pieces to protect. And when you think about your technology holistically, sometimes it can be really difficult to get down into the weeds and understand what really enables the technology to set you apart, because it's rarely all the pieces put together, and sometimes it's the individual elements. So I would suggest the best place to start is really digging into those differentiators and what sets you apart, and look across your company to get input from different people, because diversity of thought is critically important when it comes to innovation, and getting those different perspectives can really be a difference maker.
Great, thank you, Erin. A more general question. Given the mandated focus initially for IAC in the clean tech space, do you anticipate there's any appetite to expand beyond the clean tech space to other emerging technology areas?
I'll jump in there, Erin, and then pass over to you for your thoughts. But we certainly know that the foundational information that's shared at IAC would be applicable in other sectors. So we could certainly see a future where that might make sense. Would we apply the same type of model toward fintech? Would we apply it toward health tech? Would we look at other opportunities to support Canadian business? That's certainly something that's within the realm of possibility. However, I will also say that while we know there's so much focus on climate change and very interesting and active and growing clean tech sector across the country, we know there's no shortage of work in this space at this time, and it's only likely to expand. So we do believe that that will be our primary focus for the foreseeable future.
Great, thank you. We've been talking about IP. What about trade secrets? Do you have any advice on how to best protect trade secrets?
Yeah, trade secrets are really interesting when you talk about it from an IP rights perspective, because you almost develop a right by doing nothing, in a sense. Like, you register nothing when it comes to a trade secret. However, I think one of the real critical things to keep in mind in trade secrets is the value is in the secret itself. And it can be really important when potentially, there could be leakage there, trade secrets are difficult to protect if you have a lot of employee movement and stuff. And so it can be important to really think about your culture and culture from the perspective of, do all your staff, do the people who have access to the trade secret really understand the value of the secret, the importance of keeping it secret? And so a lot of the pieces around trade secrets can really come out through IP culture and building that culture of understanding, and really thinking about access when you think about trade secrets. However, there's a lot of things to keep in mind when you're sort of weighing that balance between the type of rights to protect your technology and a lot of different questions you need to ask yourself, because as I said, trade secrets, the values and the secret, and you need to understand how much employee movement exists in your business, the requirements around disclosure, are there regulatory compliance pieces where you're going to be required to do disclosure, and really making sure you've sort of thought through all those pieces, and then make sure you've developed a culture around that secret so that it can be properly protected.
A related question on this topic is, should there be a balance between trade secrets versus patents for optimizing brand growth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we like to think about IP strategy as really, it's about developing a whole portfolio of rights and understanding what rights best support different aspects of your business. I don't think there's ever an optimal ratio because it's company specific. You really have to understand your space and what comes into play. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer, but when you get into that brainstorming and really identify those enabling elements and then start thinking about those elements in that context of, what do I have to disclose? Where, how easy is it to reverse engineer? How many people are in this space? What's the access look like? You could really start developing the proper mix for your company. And of course, budget comes into play when it comes to trade secrets. Once you've developed a culture and process and have a plan for that, there aren't actually costs themselves the same way there are with other types of IP rights where there's actual formal application development process.
And then a question has just come in related to copyrights. What about copyrights?
Yeah, it really goes to the same thing. It's that same blend and understanding, the basics around what are the IP rights intended to do. And there was I didn't really get into that on this slide. And then understanding those value propositions of what you're trying to protect, what sets you apart, and is copyright a fit there? It's very popular in that SaaS algorithm space when you're developing tools in that space. Copyright could be an important part of the code component.
Great, thanks, Erin. Maybe to switch gears a little bit, a question has kind of come in related to the IP grants and IP credits. Is there any requirement for a company that is a member and that wanted to qualify for an IP grant or credit, that they actually have to have filed any IP?
Thank you for that. And, there's really this this whole program was developed to support companies rather than find reasons not to help them do what they want to do. So I'll cut out first the credit piece of it. So really, this is very broad. So we are just saying to companies, we want you to have a budget line item that is dedicated to spending on IP. We don't mind if you're spending it in Asia or Europe or North America, as long as this is something that you've dedicated some thought around your strategy. We're going to reimburse that credit wherever that expense occurs. In many cases, some of the companies that we work with say that it's fairly easy because they join IAC, they pay $15,000, and then they pay their patent lawyer and they get the full reimbursement right away. So it's not usually a big stretch if there's already IP activity at the business. So we have no real restrictions around that. The only thing that I can think of offhand is we wouldn't get involved in some litigious expenses because that's outside the scope of obviously the work that we do. In terms of the grant program, I'll underline again, it's a merit-based program. So the limitation will be how great the ideas are that are being submitted by the other member companies in the mix. We have a full list of the areas that we recognize will probably be the strongest to explore in terms of new ideas to support IP strategy, and we're certainly happy to share those with companies. But one of the things I should emphasize is that our team is really involved as a mentor throughout. When companies join IAC, there's a 1-hour intake session where the companies can share some of the areas that they feel they need support in. They can walk through the program in detail. They sort of get a real lay of the land, and our IP expert team, which is incredibly impressive in this space, can start to think about some of the needs that those companies have. In the IP grant program, there's even that kind of interaction with our staff. So if there are questions about the process, the team is more than happy to help answer and support and give some guidance. And even after the process, give feedback on what worked well, what didn't work well, and how to improve some of those applications and thought process in the future.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that, in that, like Lori said, we're really looking to incentivize that IP spend, particularly as it relates to strategy. And so we don't limit funding or grant application, I guess, for funding requests to one particular type of IP, right? It can be related to anything that's going to, I think Lori said it nicely, as move the needle for your business. So it can be, maybe you need to redevelop your employee agreements to have proper and effective IP clauses. We can provide, funding to support that. Maybe you're looking to develop an IP policy for your company to properly, support the business. We also, of course, patent applications are one of the most popular things that people apply for because patents are expensive. And in our most recent round of funding, about 36% of the requests related to development of new IP rights. But really, if we try to be quite open-minded when it comes to how we support your business, and we recognize it can be different for everybody.
Speaking of IP spend, would you agree that the strength of a company's IP protection program is only as good as the amount of money that a company has to defend its assets?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually disagree, because I think you can really build valuable assets on a limited budget if you go through the exercise of prioritizing your spend and really making sure you're protecting those key features. And I actually had the opportunity to speak with the chief strategy officer for a big Canadian success story, Adabotics. And that's exactly how they speak about it. When they first started out their company, they had a really focused spend on IP. They had a limited budget and really tried to highlight those value add line items for their business. That's what they protected, recognizing they couldn't protect everything. And I think that's something really important for companies to understand. You are the best advocate for your business, and you know where where the value comes from. And you have to be your champion when you're working with the expert service provider. They're an expert when it comes to developing IP rights and navigating the laws and the unique restrictions in each jurisdiction, but they're not an expert in your business. So you've got to tell them where the value is and what really needs to be protected. And, you know, that's your role in that. And so you can really develop these value-added assets.
Erin, for a small firm, all of this can, with limited means, all of this can seem quite overwhelming. And one of the questions that has come in, I feel that you know, we should address, because I think it just illustrates how overwhelming this could appear to small firms. So the question is, what is your perspective on patents when a small firm cannot defend them and doesn't have the resources to defend them, when those patents can easily be copied in China or Vietnam, for example? So that kind of sounds like, well, you know, they're going to be copied anyway. We can't do anything about this. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something you have to be live to, and, you know, understanding where protection makes sense for your business. And if you don't have funding or you have no plans to defend them, it could be a potential deterrent. That said, again, it can come back to your business model. And if your long-term plan is to sort of continue to develop the technology yourself, that could lead to one potential strategy and maybe lead you in a direction. But if your longer term plan is to potentially be acquired or partner or collaborate with other organizations, decisions you make around your IP on day one could have huge long-term impacts, like 5 years down the road when your company's in an entirely different position. So I would say you need to think about that long-term plan, and, you know, defending them. That in some ways, sometimes that's where I think IAC, the portfolio, can come into play. Our portfolio is just part of a company's overall IP strategy and can sometimes be utilized in being helpful in the defense side and creating leverage opportunities potentially with whoever is an asserter, or, you know, the person that's per se knocking at your door.
Can you talk?
I'm not sure that was a great answer, right? Like, it's not easy.
No, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about defending patents in countries that do not provide protection? I think you've gone on mute.
I hit the button twice. Most countries have some sort of IP system. There can be rules about what you protect. So I'm not completely sure what that question would be about. It would be whether or not you chose to protect in that jurisdiction, because you have to be strategic and, you know, protect your markets. But it's really important to recognize it's not just about patents. You can protect your technology through other mechanisms in other jurisdictions. Think about your brand. What's going to drive someone to select, you know, your brand? If you have a really strong brand presence, even if you don't necessarily have whole patent rights in that jurisdiction, it can still be a value add in terms of driving people to your product at the end of the day.
Right.
One point I'd like to jump in just to share with the meeting as well is that a solution for some companies that may not have the resources necessarily to protect their interests can also be insurance, which is something that's quite challenging potentially for an individual SME to look at. But right now, IAC is exploring this possibility on behalf of the collective. And this could give other options and other opportunities for companies to draw on those resources if they're in a situation where there's some litigious behavior, and then they have another opportunity to explore.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions that are specific to your programming. So the first question is, how do you define clean tech? What if a company has a technology or IP that has applicability in the clean tech sector, but wasn't necessarily developed and deployed in the clean tech sector?
I'm going to leave that one for Lori, because I feel like she has mastered the answer to that question.
We do ask that or answer that question a lot. And honestly, I'll go back to my statement that we are interested in helping as many companies as we can and not trying to find reasons that we can't help them. So we're quite broad around our definition. Obviously, we look for data-driven clean tech, which I would struggle to find a company that's somehow working in the clean tech space and not using data to their advantage, but still, that is a distinction we would like to make. And then really it's about having some type of environmentally positive impact in terms of an area of their business's outputs. And that doesn't mean that in all cases, every single activity has to be, something that would be clean tech. And I'll give an example of a company that we work with that is a wind power company, and they needed to protect some IP that was related to a chemical process, something to do with some treatment that they were using for their wind powered equipment. And so obviously the chemical process is not something on its own we would consider to be clean tech, but overall we definitely consider that company's efforts to be clean tech, and the environmental positive outputs that they have certainly qualify. Another one that, just to clarify, because there's been some confusion on this front, Precision Agriculture is absolutely a clean tech company in our mind. I was in a conference recently in Calgary where somebody wanted to kind of say, how could you not consider it clean tech? And I said, we do. So it was an easy answer, an easy discussion, and we certainly believe that that has all kinds of positive environmental outputs.
And a question just popped in on, do you consider reducing scrape in manufacturing as clean tech? So for example, shifting from traditional manufacturing to 3D additive manufacturing.
We have had some similar businesses. Obviously, we want to look at things in deeper detail when we make these decisions, but certainly some of the companies we work with are taking traditional businesses, let's say, maybe I won't even throw out any examples, but traditional businesses and sectors that wouldn't necessarily be thought about as clean tech, and they're greening up the kind of work that they do. So depending on the specifics around how that process is handled and what that future looks like around that company, it could certainly qualify if there's a very positive environmental output at the end of the day.
Great, thank you. And then the second question related to the supports that are available through IAC. Do you have any supports that help companies evaluate potential IP value to help support a business case?
I'll start, then let Erin add her thoughts here, but we have looked at certain aspects that we could bring to the table here. We're certainly considering some additional tools, but at this stage, I would say the most beneficial insights that a member company would gain is through conversations with our IP experts. And there may be, I don't know that it would involve a specific valuation around, for example, an IP portfolio or bringing an IP into the mix, but there would certainly be some context around valuation that could come into play in those conversations. And then of course, we're exploring other tools that might do this much more specifically. Any other additions to that, Erin?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say, our acquisition team, when they're looking at assets, will often have conversations with member companies, depending on what they're trying to value. If it's a purchase, they may bring it to our attention. And the other piece is, I think that would absolutely be an area where grant funding could be applicable if you're looking for valuation. If it's in support somehow of your IP strategy, you need to value your assets for a particular transaction.
And then the last question before we go to your final thoughts is, what about algorithms? So the question is, we have an algorithm that schedules employees based on complex rules. What kind of IP should be considered for algorithms?
Yeah, I think that's where you sort of have to, again, get down into understanding those basic building blocks of what are the components of the algorithm that sets it apart, as opposed to looking at the algorithm as a line item in and of itself. What's it enabling, and understanding those pieces, and then breaking it down from there.
Great, thank you. So in the last minute, any final thoughts, Lori and Erin, to SMEs that that have technologies and are developing IP in the clean tech sector, what guidance and final thoughts would you give to them?
I think the one thing I would like to say is IP is a teachable skill. You don't go to school to learn about IP, and it's a matter of investing the time and understanding, and be confident in yourself. You are the champion for your business. And while you might not be the person drafting and crafting those IP assets, certainly you can become conversant. So you can be IP literate and really learn how to work effectively and develop those value added pieces for your business.
Lori.
My last thought would be to really think of IAC as a resource for your company. We encourage you to reach out. We're here to help, and we really want to support businesses as they make this journey. I just got off a call with a member company who said IAC is their primary IP knowledge hub, and it was very good to hear that, and we're very happy to provide that support to any company that can come on board as a member company. So please reach out.
Lori, Erin, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and experience. IP is critical to competitiveness, and it's great to know that there is a resource that is available to SMEs to help them succeed in their commercialization journey. Once again, thank you, and thank you to all of our participants today. Thank you.
Thank you for everything, Claudia. Take care.
Thanks, Claudia.
Bye-bye.